Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. This is Adam Huss coming to you from Los Angeles. Thanks so much for listening to this second part of what I guess is now a series on how to make clean, delicious, natural wine. And I'm doing this partly because of feedback about questions and things that weren't quite described in detail that I skimmed over, as well as the need to really correct at least one term that I used injudiciously and that could cause disaster for you if you took it literally or took it the wrong way. So you'll hear that right at the beginning. So please, if you listen to part one, please listen to this to just get that correction or nuance about that term and what I really should have said or how I should have explained it in the first part to be a little more clear and a little more safe. Also, your feedback is really appreciated. So any feedback on this episode is much appreciated as well. Once again, this is unscripted, although this time I wasn't driving because it was technical and I wanted the ability to make sure, follow notes and make sure I was covering everything to also be able to come back and edit in a few little corrections and details that if I did miss anything. So it's unscripted, but a little more carefully executed. So thank you again for your understanding and your kindness and your compassion as you listen to this. Look forward for a part 3 about sparkling, as well as answers to any questions that come up from this episode. I think you're going to enjoy it, and this one is technical and fun, so dig in, grab a notepad, and thanks so much for listening. Okay, I'll jump right in and start by correcting or sort of adding some nuance to something I said last time. I used the term seal, as in ferment your grapes or fruit in a sealed container. And I should not have used the word sealed because that implies airtight, which you definitely don't want to do, because if you put fermenting fruit into an airtight container, it will explode. So don't do that. I wouldn't even put it into a sealed container with a bubbler on it, like a barrel with a bung plug with a bubbler sticking out the top, because that will even create too much pressure once primary kicks off, and the pressure will just pop that bung right out and overflow like a volcano. Let me get even more nuanced and say that I would actually start with the bubbler on, but then once primary starts, I would remove the bubbler and allow that CO2 to escape as quickly as possible to not build up pressure. In fact, having nothing in the bung hole in a barrel fermentation or something like that, if you're in a flex tank and you're just have simply the bung hole of the flex tank, or any other cask or anything like that where you just have a small hole, when primary kicks off, just a tiny hole like that might be too much closure, and you, depending on how full you have it. So that's the other thing, is learning how full you can fill your barrels for an in-barrel fermentation, because when primary kicks off, it will create a lot of gas and bubbles, and if you have it pressurized in any way, it will just become a volcano. So what I find works best, and so this is what I do. If I'm doing an in-barrel fermentation, I'm just being sure to leave a really good amount of headspace. So figure about I'm only filling the barrel about 70% full with juice, and same would go with a tank or flex tank, something like that. You want about 30% of just headspace for gas production, and then you want it pretty open. You don't want that hole plugged up at the top. Unless you are doing a very cool fermentation, which I'll come back to. So a cool fermentation is going to be less vigorous. And then in that case, you do want maybe a bubbler on there. You'll be able to tell, and you know what, maybe you'll make a mistake and you will create a little volcano, and that's how you'll learn how much you can do at the temperatures that you're working at, and how much, what kind of coverage you should have on your tank. What I really wanted you to do was not seal or what I'm recommending is not making an airtight seal on the fermenter, but preventing oxygen from, or just the ambient air from blowing off your CO2 blanket. So you want it covered by something So what I do, and this is what works really well for me, if I'm not doing in barrel, if I'm doing in barrel, like I said, it's like a 70% full, and then I probably will put a bubbler on, although at a certain point the bubbler is even too much if you have a really vigorous in barrel fermentation, even if you only fill it 70%. So I'll just open the bung at that point, just leave an open bung hole, because it's pushing out so much CO2 at that point. There's no point in even trying to protect it or worrying about oxygen getting in, because it's just like a hose of CO2 squirting out of that bunghole. I'm really enjoying getting the opportunity to say bunghole as much as I'm saying it right now, by the way. Okay, so back to what I do normally, not in barrel fermentation, is I'll have a macro bin or T-bin where I have must, whatever form, whole cluster, whatever, getting the fermentation going. What I do, I get the grapes in there or fruit, and then throw in a chunk of dry ice, for example. Or if I have an active fermentation already going that's producing lots of CO2, I'll just run a hose, literally just any kind of tube from the active fermentation into the new must bin, and let that fill up with CO2 from the active fermentation, which also has lots of sweet esters and things in it, which kind of is nice rather than just straight up dry ice CO2. But in the absence of an active fermentation, I will just throw dry ice in. And as soon as I throw the dry ice in on top, maybe, if I have a macro bin or a T-bin, literally it's just maybe a 5 or 10 pound chunk of dry ice. It produces plenty of CO2 to create a blanket of CO2 on the top of that. And then I lay a piece of painter's drop cloth, which is like a roll of plastic sheeting that you can just cut to fit. I'll lay that over the top of the bin, the macro bin or T-bin, and then over that I'll put an old sheet, a clean but old sheet, and then so that creates sort of weight and protection as well. And then and also reflection from light and things like that, because that plastic is see-through, it will allow light penetration. So just to keep UV out of there, if it's outdoors, I put the sheet over for multiple reasons. And then I strap bungee cords around that, so it's nice and firm like a drum across the top of the T-bin or macro bin. You don't want the plastic or the sheeting to be dragging on the ground. This goes back to the cleanliness that I talked about. So that's one of the things that I'm careful about. I don't want those things dragging on the ground, just creating some connection, from ground microbes up onto the, over the must, because that's hanging over the must. So I'm just making sure to tuck in my corners after I strap the bungee cords around. And what that will, the gas that's being produced by that CO2 is trapped in there. And I don't open that until fermentation kicks off. I literally and the reason I don't do that is because I'm in California, Southern California. So my fermentations generally kick off, in a couple days, because it's warm. The ambient temperature is pretty warm, 80s during the day, average. So that creates this really optimal environment for the wild yeast. The wild yeast generally have no problem in that volume of a must, a half ton or a ton of grapes or fruit, kicking off really quickly. So that CO2 blanket, since it's not being blown off, it's sort of like if you've ever used the Coravin, where you're displacing the wine in the bottle by sticking a needle through the cork, and you squirt in argon and it squirts out wine. So essentially the idea is that you are preserving the wine by not introducing oxygen and not opening the cork, but you get to taste the wine. So it's like, if you're the kind of person who can't drink a bottle all at once, this is a way to theoretically preserve the bottle and get a glass out of it. The same idea applies here. By the way, I don't think the Coravin works. I've done taste tests after just a week of using it, like where I took out maybe 2 glasses out of a bottle using the Coravin, and a week later tasted it side by side with another bottle that I opened fresh that day, and there were definite differences. So just a heads up about that. So back to this. So you're doing exactly the same idea. You're essentially like replacing the oxygen or other gases specifically oxygen, replacing that, displacing it with a CO2, which is the heavier gas, which is going to blanket the top of the must. And then you're not opening the bottle, so to speak, until fermentation kicks off, at which point the must itself will be producing its own CO2 and plenty of it to displace any oxygen that might come in. I still keep it closed. What happens is that coverage, the sheet and plastic sheeting, just lifts up. You just see a big bubble, like a big convex top to it. So it's no longer sinking down over the must. It just gets pushed up. But because bungee cords wrapped around the edge don't make it airtight, it can squeeze out, and it's perfect. It's not like this huge amount of pressure building up that's going to rip the sheet off or anything like that. So it kind of works perfectly that way. And then, obviously once that starts happening, I do remove it to punch down the must once a day. So I'm doing like 1 a day punch downs for, look, this again becomes a stylistic thing, but for me, it's like a lot of times I'm working with whole cluster for various reasons. And if I want minimal extraction and minimal, like essentially minimal extraction, because I don't want to get it stemmy from the whole cluster inclusion, that once a day is plenty. And I leave a few whole clusters in there as well, uncrushed, even if I crush some at the beginning to help get that fermentation going. I leave some uncrushed so that when I'm doing punch downs, I'm actually squeezing some fresh new juice out of those uncrushed berries, and that's sort of goosing the fermentation, giving a little extra sugar to the yeast so that they get like this fresh squeezed juice that they start fermenting again, and it's like throwing gas on the fire basically. So when I cover it back up, they immediately are producing lots more CO2 by starting to gobble up that fresh juice. So that's sort of my secret. Is very not secret. I don't know what I'm talking about. There's no secret to this. It's been done by many people for time immemorial. So I'm just telling you what I do, how I've incorporated these things. All of this is in an effort to, keep it probiotic. You don't have to use sulfur. And again, the word seal was the wrong word. So just, keep that in mind. Okay, so the pied de couve, like that is one thing I didn't mention just now as a way to get started. The pied de couve is a really nice way, especially if you are working in cooler temperatures where your main fermentation, the main body of the must, whatever the fruit juice or must, whatever it is, pulp that you're working with, is if you're in a cooler climate, like I said, it can take a lot longer for that to kick off naturally. And so if you've already started some starter fermentations, the pied de couves, then that will just essentially inoculate the yeast, inoculate that new must much more quickly. The idea there is you can get a 5-gallon bucket. So a pied de couve, you basically get a 5-gallon bucket, you mash a bunch of fruit into it. Actually, what I would suggest, and probably traditionally the way this is done, is get 3 or 4 5-gallon buckets and crush some fruit in them, because some of those are going to, and do the same thing, like put a piece of plastic over the top of each bucket and wait until that stuff kicks off. And then smell them and see, you don't want to use the one that smells like ethyl acetate or nail polish remover, or any of the other off aromas that you can get from a microbial spoilage situation. So you want it to smell like a nice clean fermentation, and then use that as your, inoculant for the must, the main must, when the fruit comes in. And you can just throw that on top, throw it on the bottom. I would throw it on the bottom, and it's got a little CO2 producing already, and it will also rapidly inoculate the main must. So it will start producing CO2 quickly, and you don't have to worry about dry ice. You can, there's obviously there's still going to be some oxygen, a little more than if you created that CO2 blanket, but this is where it's like, you roll the dice as a natural winemaker sometimes. It is a more risky form of fermentation if you think, I guess risk is a word that is fraught with all kinds of meaning. But you have the more opportunity for VA, for example, in the presence of oxygen. And at warm temperatures, you do more so. So I would use the pied de couve if you were in a cooler climate with ambient temperatures, like below 65, where it might be not as conducive for the yeast to kick off natively. But if you're in a warmer ambient temperature, outdoor or wherever you're fermenting, I would skip the pied de couve and just focus on keeping a CO2 blanket on your must and letting that main must yeast kick off as quickly as possible, because it's going to work pretty quickly because of the ambient temperatures being warmer. You just are in a much better situation for that. I mean, you could do both. You could do pied de couve and a CO2 blanket on top. And there's really no harm in throwing 5 to 10 pounds of dry ice on top of your must. Yes, it will freeze those berries or fruits that it immediately comes into contact with on the surface, but it turns to gas so rapidly that it just doesn't cause a problem for the majority of the must. And yes, right around wherever it touches, you will inhibit yeast production, but that's okay. It's not going to cause a problem for the majority of the yeast. All right, I hope that gives a little more detail about some of those things. I also wanted to mention, I talked about the pH. So I put these upper limits on temperature, where I think if you're under 65 is great. If you're and pH, if you're under 3.5 is great. There are lower limits to both of those as well. Like, there is a nice sweet spot. And for temperature, it's like, if you get down below 55, you're going to have a really slow fermentation, and you might inhibit malolactic, or you might have a very, very slow malolactic process. And pH is the same. So you want to be under 3.5, but you want to, once you get down below 3.1, 3.0, it's hard for even yeast and malolactic bacteria to do their job. So, that's kind of the range is in there. There's certainly some yeast that will eventually come in there and start fermenting it. Malolactic is a different thing. Usually you'll be able to get some of that, but it is inhibitive for everything once you get down below 3.1, 3.0. So think about that as well as your range. Always, just I realized I was under 3.5, but you could go down to 2.8 and think that was fine because it's under 3.5. It's not. Probably nothing is going to happen to those grapes. Well, something will, but it won't probably be what you want it to be. And there's probably examples to the contrary of these things. This is just, the mid-range for the most success. Your highest success rate is going to be in this sweet spot. And, outside these ranges, of course, is possible. And this is where you start rolling those dice and, making your judgment calls. This is where, depends on what you have a stomach for, and, what you can endure in terms of, sleepless nights worrying about whether you've ruined, 2 tons of fruit by some choice that you've made. Or whether you just want to, try to keep it in that range where it's a little more, assured of success. Although, it's like investing. There's no guarantee. I don't know if it's like investing anyway. So those are just some touchbacks to some of the things that I mentioned that I should have fleshed out a little bit. Temperature is probably that other one. Where I said under 65, now I'm saying and over 55. What I mean by that is that if an ambient temperature, so you don't the must itself will be warm once fermentation kicks off. It's usually going to come in cool. Hopefully grapes. It depends on where you're picking grapes, when you're picking grapes, but you want the grapes or fruit to come in cool, ideally. Again, temperature does inhibit spoilage microorganisms, specifically related to VA and Brettanomyces and mouse. Whether you think of Brettanomyces yeast as a spoilage microorganism or not, I'm just throwing it out there. Don't take it as a judgment call. It's just, if you want to not have Brettanomyces, then cooler temperatures will help with that. It's one of the things. VA for sure, the VA bacteria are inhibited slightly by cooler temperatures. So generally having cooler temperatures ambient during fermentation are great. The must is going to warm up. The must will get up to 90 degrees or, sometimes more depending on how hot and vigorous of fermentation, just by the kinetics of fermentation, the yeast are producing their own heat, which is why, having an ambient temperature around the fermentation that's a little bit cooler is nice, so you keep that fermentation from becoming this super hot thing, because this is, again, we're getting into the realm of subjectivity here, but generally speaking, it's thought of to produce a more subtle, more nuanced, more elegant wine if you have a slower, cooler fermentation. Now, this is definitely depending on your preference, and it's an opinion-based thing. So you have to figure out, I think it would be great if you had the ability to do the same grapes in two different ways, where you had a hot, fast fermentation and a slow, cool fermentation of exactly the same grapes, the same year, controlling for everything except for temperature and the speed of the fermentation, and then see what you like. Taste that wine after a year, taste that wine after 2 years, and see if it makes a difference to you. And if it makes a difference, which one is your preference? Because I think there will be a difference, but whether you like that or not, or think it's worse or better, depending on the cooler versus warmer fermentation, may depend a lot on where you are, the style of wine you like, the grapes or fruit that you're working with, the style that you're trying to accomplish or achieve. So yeah, lots of things come into play, but that's where, you kind of make a call. I mean, there's so many things that are impossible to control. I mean, there's so many, what am I trying to say? There's so many factors that you can control, that temperature is one of those that the way that I deal with it is during the fermentation, I'm not too worried about it. I have my preferences. I wish it was cool, but I live in Southern California, and during harvest, the reality is it's 80s and 90s outside, and that's generally where these fermentations are getting started, and that's just what it is. So I concern myself much more with the pH and the CO2 blanket that I'm keeping on top of the must, and just inhibiting microbial spoilage those ways. Also, one of the other reasons you might be doing your fermentations outside is because of the CO2. So this is a safety concern that I want to make sure to bring up. In your effort to control the temperature, especially if you're working out of your house or, a space where you're living or whatever, don't bring that fermentation inside, especially if it's a big fermentation. Like a couple carboys, no big deal. But if you're in a closed space with a big fermentation, a ton or more, you're producing a lot of CO2, and that is not healthy for you or any other living creatures like pets that might be in that indoor space. So, just consider that. That's one of the other reasons why maybe you're going to be a little more forgiving during primary when you're producing a lot of CO2 with the temperature. You're going to be a little more forgiving with the temperature because you're going to want that outside where it is not going to be trapped in a living space with living creatures. And then once primary is done, I'm keeping my barrel room cool. So, or the winery and where the barrel and the wine is stored, that's going to be under 65. So that's sort of the way I deal with it, is like after primary, I want that wine to live in a cool environment, and that thereby, because it's going to live now as it's losing CO2, as that CO2 rich wine is slowly, that CO2 is slowly dissolving out of solution, and therefore your wine is less protected. You don't also want it then to be warm, because the CO2 will dissolve out more quickly, and the warm temperatures will favor these other things while your wine is not protected by sulfur. Which, even if you decide to add sulfur, you really want to wait till after malolactic is finished to do that. So while you're waiting for malolactic to finish, your wine is, unprotected. So that's a good reason to keep it in an ambient, cool temperature. So I keep, think of it as like whatever happens during the fermentation. If you can control it, great. If you can't, then definitely focus on, the CO2 and oxygen exclusion, as well as pH, and control pH or managing pH, and then also moving it into a cool environment after primary so that it can age in that environment. All right, so those are the follow-ups to the last one. To part one, I should say, of the of this how to make clean, natural, delicious, natural wine. There's a couple things that I didn't get into that I think I got some questions about, and I think it probably does make a lot of sense because there's a lot of ways that you can screw things up still, even if you've made it through all this. And so racking is a big question, and it brings up several other issues, such as hydrogen sulfide, which is another, what I would say, spoilage of natural wine. It's not caused by a specific microorganism like Brett or the Acetobacter. It is actually created by the yeast, and we'll get into that. So generally, the rule is after primary fermentation, you're pressing, and then you're letting juice settle, and you're going to have these gross lees that are all the dead yeast cells from primary fermentation that didn't, get stuck in the must as you were pressing, and they are going to be this heavy goopy mass that settles to the bottom. And generally, the idea is that you rack after 24 to 48, between 24 and 48 hours after pressing, and so you let it settle for that amount of time, 24 to 48 hours. And then you rack off those gross lees into wherever that wine is going to stay for a long time. There's a couple reasons you would do this, which is you do it quickly because the wine is still rich with CO2 from primary, so it's protected as you're moving it that second time. So you pressed it, you moved it, and exposed it to a lot of oxygen. Now you're moving it one more time, exposing it to a lot of oxygen. But it's early enough in the process and close enough to primary that, generally speaking, there is a lot of CO2 still in there. The exception to that would be if you had a really long maceration, like if you did like a month of on-must maceration for whatever reason. Some people do that, and it adds things, and it's a stylistic choice. But if you're not pressing till after that, then that is a very oxygen-rich environment at this point, and we're very, I would say, CO2 poor environment for the wine. And so you just think about that when you're doing that, and what kind of actions you can take to prevent as much exposure as possible, or to protect the wine as much as possible. But generally speaking, if you're I mean, what I'm trying to do generally is press with a little bit of sugar still in the grapes, in the must or whatever, in the juice, and letting that means that it's still fermenting as I'm pressing. So there's yeast that are active that are creating CO2 as the wine is being moved. And then I may not rack off gross lees. And this is, I would say as a rule, especially if you're getting started and you haven't had experience sniffing lees and getting to know lees, there's a difference between gross lees and then there's gross lees. So like, ooh, gross lees. It's a sniff difference. Like you can smell it, sort of. Like you can smell it on the wine, and you can smell it at the end of fermentation too. You generally speaking, you're going to smell hydrogen sulfide, and that's where we get into hydrogen sulfide. So hydrogen sulfide, H2S, is that farty broccoli cooked smell, the sewagey rotten egg smell that, is unpleasant to me. It is hydrogen sulfide is used to scent natural gas because natural gas is odorless, and we can detect hydrogen sulfide at 6 parts per billion. So it's one of the most, smelly substances on the planet. There's one more that I will tell you about shortly. So it is something that is generally unpleasant. I don't like it. It is a noxious gas that is not good for you. Like in any large quantity, it can kill you. So, to me, I just think it makes sense to eliminate that as much as possible from my wine. And it is also a very volatile gas, which is good for us as winemakers because generally that means that racking and exposing the wine to a lot of oxygen will blow off those smells if it's not like an excessive amount. When I find H2S hydrogen sulfide to happen most often is in white juice or rosé juice fermentations, because the reasons H2S happen, and it's usually in the second half of the fermentation, and this is why, because H2S is caused by stressed yeast. Yeast produce it in small quantities throughout fermentation, but in the absence of sufficient nutrients, especially nitrogen, the yeast become a little stressed out. They're not getting their full nutritional needs, not eating a balanced diet. And that is something that is much more easy for them to get in the presence of stems and skins and seeds and everything that is in the whole cluster of the grape. You'll notice it a lot less, and that is because there's much more nutritional value in a whole cluster, or even just on skin fermentation, than in just a juice fermentation. So that you'll tend to smell it at the end of these juice fermentations. Now, since this is a nutritional situation, this is another area where this kind of thing can be prevented, or at least modulated or managed in the vineyard, by having really healthy, vibrant vines growing in an amazing soil ecosystem, and where they are able to uptake and put into the grapes all of the nutrients that they need and want for healthy grapes for a healthy fermentation. So, this is literally where the way that you farm and the way the vines can grow and the ecosystem that you build affects the smell of the vine, the smell of the wine. And this is something that you can measure. It's called yeast available nitrogen. So if you crush your grapes and do a juice sample before fermentation and send that to a lab, they can send you back a YAN number. And that YAN number, I've found, if it's over 200, generally have no issues with hydrogen sulfide. If it's between 150 and 200, it depends. This is one of those areas where if I'm doing a juice fermentation, it's likely. But if I'm doing a whole cluster, or on skin fermentation, it's unlikely. And under 150 is where you got to start, thinking about the health of the vineyard, and maybe trying to do some stuff in the vineyard that allow the vines to get access to more nitrogen. Now, there is a balancing act here, and this is, getting into viticulture as winemaking, because you don't want to just load nitrogen-rich compost into your vineyard if you have low YANs, because you can create tons of vigor for the vines, because nitrogen will really just bump up vegetative growth, and that's not necessarily great for grape quality. So you might increase the YANs, but you might do other things. You might cause quality issues another way by having the vines spending tons of energy on vegetative growth rather than reproductive growth. So there is this balance. Essentially, again, you don't want to think about these things as individual nutrients that you must give. Don't think about it in isolation. This is a whole system. So you try to improve the health of the whole system, because the vines can pull nitrogen out of the air. They just need a health and vitality and a microbe rich soil so that they can work in combination with the microbes, as well as do their own photosynthetic and other jobs in the best, most healthy, most vital way. And so it's not yes, can you add a nice chicken manure compost, and it definitely has rich, of course, yeah, it's good with rich in nitrogen, stuff like that. But it's not, you don't think of it as I'm going to just inject my vines with nitrogen. You're creating, again, soil health, and the vines will take what they need. They'll find their balance, and that's what you're trying to help with, just to make them feel healthy. Let's say you have let's say for whatever reason, you're not measuring your YANs, and even if you do, that's just, now it, great, I have low YANs, but I already have fruit, and I already have a fermenting must, so I'm likely going to have hydrogen sulfide is all it tells you. So let's just assume you encounter hydrogen sulfide at some point in your fermentation journey. And okay, so like I said, it is a volatile gas, and so again, what I would do is, if I start smelling that on a rosé or white fermentation that's just juice, I'm really looking forward to that initial rack off the primary juice when I get it, because at that point, essentially, the advantage to a juice fermentation is you don't have to do a press and then a rack. You're essentially letting the dead yeast cells and sediment fall out of the juice as it finishes primary, and then you only have to rack it once into its new container. Some people would do it twice, but I don't think you need to. And the kind of racking that you do would depend to me on whether I smell hydrogen sulfide. If I don't smell it, I'm going to do a pretty reductive, or I'm trying to exclude oxygen from that movement of the wine as much as possible. So there's a couple ways you can do that. One, the simplest way is just using gravity. If you're using a gravity transfer, gravity rack, then essentially you just put the hose or tube at the bottom of whatever vessel you are racking into, so that as the wine flows in, it immediately covers up the hose, and so all the new wine flows in under a blanket of wine and is not being, only the top layer of wine is exposed to oxygen, and all the new wine flowing in comes in under wine. It's still, obviously there's oxygen exposure there, but it's a way to minimize it. You could sparge that container that you're racking into with an inert gas like nitrogen or argon or CO2, if you have like a tank of that or some source of that. So that's another way that you could exclude oxygen. And then there is a whole technique called bulldogging, where you are forcing nitrogen into the barrel or tank that you're racking out of, and that displaces the wine and forces the wine out. And so you're essentially racking in the absence of oxygen, and you can rack to a container that has been sparged with nitrogen as well. And so you're, not that there is zero oxygen exposure, but you're minimizing it in every way possible in that. And I don't know why it's called bulldogging. It's an interesting term. It sounds like something that would be much more aggressive, and yet it's, in terms of like the wine treatment, like a bulldog, but it actually is a gentle way to move wine in the sense that you aren't exposing it to oxygen. All right, so I looked this up, and it turns out bulldogging gets its name from the manufacturer of the Bulldog Pup wand, which is the racking wand that is used for this technique. It was manufactured by Bulldog Manufacturing. And so they named the wand the Bulldog Pup, and that's where we get the term bulldogging. Okay, so that's if I don't smell hydrogen sulfide. If I do smell hydrogen sulfide, I want oxygen exposure. So however I'm racking, I'm letting the nozzle of the racking tube stay at the top of the opening of the vessel that I'm racking into, and so that wine is falling and splashing into that vessel. So I call it a splashy rack. So I want to do a splashy rack if I smell H2S. And generally speaking, if you use a pump, depending on the kind of pump you do, there are some extremely gentle pumps that are very expensive, and I know some people that use them because they are trying to be gentle in the wine with movement, because pumps generally do a lot of infusion of oxygen. They into the wine, so it's sort of like a massive. You're aging the wine in a few seconds. You're rapidly aging it in a few seconds, which, if you have a big hydrogen sulfide stink on your wine, might be a good thing. So maybe consider pumping using a pump to rack in this case where you have a lot of hydrogen sulfide, because that generally will blow off. If you especially if you're combining a pump rack with a splashy, a pumped and splashy rack will generally give you plenty of oxygen exposure, and you shouldn't smell hydrogen sulfide after the rack. Or you might smell a little, and then a day later you'll sniff the bunghole and be like, yeah, it's gone. Or it will be noticeably reduced. And so I mentioned there are two reasons why you would rack off the gross lees. One, early, right away, and that's at between 24 and 48 hours after pressing. One is because you still get the CO2. The other is because those gross lees can contain a lot of that stinkiness because they're dead yeast cells. The yeast got stressed out and died, so a lot of times they were producing hydrogen sulfide, and those gross lees are gross. They're gross lees because they're stinky, and if you let the wine remain on those gross lees, then it will infuse the wine with that stinkiness. So that's the other reason why you might want to rack off gross lees. However, if you have a pretty healthy fermentation, you don't smell any hydrogen sulfide at fermentation, those gross lees might not be a bad thing, like especially if you don't want to move the wine very much. If you're working in the absence of sulfites and sulfur, maybe you can get away without racking. And I certainly try that. I try to keep my wine on gross lees unless I smell hydrogen sulfide. The other thing is lees actually can benefit and remove hydrogen sulfide. So they can be both an infusion of hydrogen sulfide if you have gross lees, but if you have clean, fine lees, there's actually a treatment for hydrogen sulfide called a lees transplant, where you move stinky wine, the hydrogen sulfide infused wine, onto new lees that are clean and let it age, and those lees will actually reabsorb the hydrogen sulfide. I'm not going to get into the chemistry of how that happens, but it is a treatment. So good lees, and I mean, personal experience, a lot of times, so if you're doing in-bottle fermentations, for example, so this is my personal experiences. When I crushed Crenshaw Cru for the first time, put it into bottle and reinitiated in-bottle fermentation with a little bit of organic sugar in the bottles under pressure. Then, it was all done, disgorged, and I poured out my first glass, pretty much like 2 weeks after we'd put it into bottle. I was so excited to try it. And I was like, oh, it's beautiful. The bubbles are beautiful. Everything about the texture, the flavor, everything is great, but the nose was stinky. It wasn't terribly stinky. And this is the fine line. It wasn't terribly stinky, but, I'm sensitive to these things. This is probably why I'm a winemaker, because I have like this nose that is really sensitive. And I was like, man, what a bummer. And I was like, should I just quickly go through and disgorge everything? Like, obviously that developed in bottle because of the in-bottle fermentation, because there was no nutritional value. It was just literally raw organic sugar was thrown in there with these yeast that were already just ambient, a few little ambient yeast left over from the primary fermentation. And clearly that all developed in bottle, and so maybe I should just get rid of all, disgorge everything and get rid of those lees. Well, I didn't. I was like, you know what? I've heard this. The smell is, it's definitely detectable, and it was detectable to other people. It wasn't not just because I'm sensitive, but I could tell that it wasn't this high threshold of H2S because I have enough experience smelling it. So I was like, I'll just leave it in bottle and just keep riddling and let these bottles age on their lees for a while, which is very traditional in Champagne. And I discovered why, because when we opened those bottles 6 months later and disgorged, that hydrogen sulfide had been completely reabsorbed by the in-bottle lees, and when we disgorged, it was gone. It was like magic, and it was beautiful, and it was such a great lesson to learn. And so lees can be good is the other aspect of this. A lot of times this is, like I said, a judgment call, and it comes from having had the experience and rolling the dice a couple times and knowing when it works and what level, just based on that smell, your detector, your sensory detection, how much is enough and how much is too much, and what will dissipate, what will not dissipate. And this is a call so that you want to, this is another point. You want to deal with H2S if it bothers you, if it's something that you want to avoid in your wine. You want to deal with it early on. Number one, again, like I said, because CO2-rich wine, still protected somewhat after fermentation, after primary with dissolved CO2. But number two, and this is the more important one, H2S in the presence of alcohol. So if you let that H2S stay in there, it becomes a longer chain molecule called a mercaptan. Oh, Captain Mercaptan. Mercaptans are not as volatile, so they are much harder to remove from your wine. And so essentially, once you've aged hydrogen sulfide in your alcohol solution of wine and created mercaptans, it's going to smell like that forever. I hate to say it. The other thing I hate to say is, you know how I said hydrogen sulfide is detectable at 6 parts per billion? Well, mercaptan is detectable at 0.06 parts per billion, making it possibly the smelliest substance on the planet. There is a way to remove it. It's not a natural solution. It's by adding copper sulfate and a tiny bit of copper into your wine. Generally binds to the mercaptan and pulls it out. I have tasted wines that this has happened to, where it's been treated this way. To me, I can always sort of tell there's there's just something about it. So it's just something you want to avoid, in my opinion. I don't want the stink, and I don't want to treat it with copper sulfate. So I try to get rid of hydrogen sulfide while it's hydrogen sulfide before it becomes mercaptans. Now, there is, and this is the other thing. When you have these sort of low detectable levels of hydrogen sulfide, and it's a little bit like, I don't know, it's more like just a light sulfur smell. Like it's not like rotten eggs in your face. It's more like a burnt match stick kind of thing, or like a burnt match. It's hard to describe, but it's bordering on stinky and just being like sulfuric, if that makes any sense. Probably doesn't, but so this isn't very helpful. But it's a lighter smell. You'll smell this in barrel, and that is, it's just called reduction at that point. I wouldn't call it the stinkies. And reduction actually is not a bad thing. Eventually it will go away because your wine is oxidizing slowly over time. Reduction literally just means the absence of oxygen. So in a way, it's protecting your wine. You've created, if you've been really careful, like I've, following the things that I've sort of talked about, using a CO2 blanket and managing CO2 well, and not racking too much if you don't have to. All of those things will help create a reductive environment, and that reduction can sometimes just smell just a little bit like sulfur, and that's not a bad thing. That usually will just go away because you are going to bottle eventually. You're going to expose it to more and more oxygen. It's being micro-oxygenated if it's in a barrel, or if it's in a clay vessel of any kind. It might be being more than micro-oxygenated depending on your vessel. Generally speaking, you that will go away, and it's actually like a little protective thing. Again, this is hard, and this is like getting into the finer points of like learning from experience and just knowing these differences by just smelling, sort of like being able to go out into a vineyard and bite into a grape but not have to measure it and be like, yeah, that's ready to pick kind of thing. That just takes time. You got to eat a lot of grapes and come away with a lot of stripped enamel and and purple lips or whatever. But that is the idea of hydrogen sulfide. The other thing in the vineyard that I forgot to mention now, I'm just looking at my notes, that is a prevention for hydrogen sulfide is not getting sulfur on the grapes. So this is much harder because one of the reasons that wine can develop H2S is because there's already sulfur when the grapes come in, because sulfur is the number one organic spray to prevent mildew in the vineyard. So it's the cheapest, most readily available, and it's used enormously. So if you aren't controlling what you're doing, if you aren't controlling the viticulture, likely there's some sulfur being sprayed on your grapes. A lot of times this won't matter. They're generally speaking, good farmers are stopping using sulfur at veraison, and there's a lot of time for it to break down before harvest. So you're just getting, but the grapes do absorb some of that, so it's embedded in the grapes as well. And then the other factor is the grapes themselves. Some grapes just tend to have reductive fermentations, like Syrah is one of those. So if you're working with Syrah, and there's several other varieties where this is true, and you probably know it if you're working with them, because you have these issues all the time. That's just grape genetics. That's just the genetics that you're stuck with because of those grapes. And so what I do, since I work with Syrah, which tends to reduction in the winery, is I don't use sulfur in the vineyard to minimize it in every way. So what I do for the Syrah is use stylet oil first, and then I switch to organocide, which is sesame oil and fish emulsion, and then I switch finally to cinerate, which is a cinnamon oil extract, and that is the last spray that I use up into veraison. And I figure if there's a little bit of cinnamon flavor in my grapes, it's going to be fine. I don't mind a little pie spice on my wine. I haven't experienced that at all, so I don't think that actually is the case. I think it breaks down long before, but I'm not using sulfur because I'm using these other substances, and hopefully that has helped. Although I can't tell you that it has, honestly. I think it, again, depends on soil health is much more important, but it's just something to consider in the vineyard. So I think that's it for now. Again, any questions, let me know. Thanks. Well, that was abrupt. Thanks so much for listening. If you found any value in this and would love to give a donation for me to be able to continue to provide this information, which I basically provide on a volunteer basis, you can send a donation to our Venmo, which is at Centralis, CENTRALAS. And it will say my name, Adam Huss, and there you go, if you'd love to give a donation. And if you have any questions, of course, please email me or comments at info@centraliswine.com. That's info@CENTRALASwine.com. Thanks.